Well, good morning. I'm Mac Beard, and the Arts and Crafts Center has invited me today to talk about the exhibit, which is about the C&O life in Clifton Forge, Virginia. I was the archivist for the C&O for about 11 years, and glad to have the opportunity to come and speak to that today. And this is Candy.
Hi, I'm Candy Barnes. I'm a volunteer here at the Arts Center.
So what we'd like to show you today are just some of the things that the gallery offers for your viewing and exploration. This particular painting that we start with is titled The Engineer, and it's a composite of 5 different engineers that worked for the C&O, and it was painted to represent, have a good representation of the men that held that job. One part of the exhibit is the photography of Chuck Alvarez, and in these particular examples, Chuck has done an amazing job of merging old photographs with photographs from today, superimposed upon each other. The Chesapeake Historical Society, Chesapeake and Ohio Historical Society, they have over 40,000 photographic negatives. And Chuck has been able to utilize those negatives with modern photographs that he took in the early 2000s. Today, all of these structures are gone. They're no longer available to walk through and see, so we're very fortunate that Chuck had the foresight to capture these images for us. Part of the job as an archivist at the COHS was trying to make the railroad relative to people. A lot of people they've never ridden a steam engine. They never worked for the railroad. So how do you make that technology, that industry relative? Well, most everybody's been to the doctor. So the C&O Railroad owned the hospital in Clifton Forge. And here's a photograph of it. One aspect about the railroad and its impact on a community is the great example of the C&O Hospital in Clifton Forge. If you were a railroad employee, you simply showed your employee card at the desk. They would admit you, and your hospital needs, medical needs, were taken care of. In 1959, the first pacemaker implant performed in Virginia was performed at the C&O Hospital in Clifton Forge. The patient's name was H.W. Hoffman. He was a patient of Dr. Charles Ballou. And in 1959, a pacemaker was really leading edge, cutting edge medicine. Included in the gallery are works of Alan Hickman, who was a C&O employee for many years in the shops. Alan's always loved trains. As a matter of fact, the C&O had an employee magazine for their employees, and the children of the employees could send pictures. So when Alan was 9 years old, he sent a drawing which was published in the employee magazine in 1924. And it's very, very cool. So Alan never quit. The safety posters that you see in the exhibit are amazing examples of the industrial art and marketing that the C&O utilized. They're wonderful in their composition and expression. These date about 1924, in the 20s, 30s, and on up through the 50s. This is an example of C&O's effort to maintain passenger traffic. They were primarily, their money was earned from hauling coal and iron and other things for industry. But on their passenger trains, they actually had things for like theater cars for children and adults, where that they would show movies. In this case, it happens to be a Disney-themed movie. The whole idea was to attract passengers, families, to travel on the railroad.
What's the origin of Chessie, the cat?
Oh, Chessie's a really good story. There was an ad executive named Robert Probert, and he worked for the C&O, and he was given the task of coming up with a marketing idea for this new invention called air conditioning. So he saw in the newspaper this etching by a Viennese artist called Guido Gruenwald, and it was a sleeping kitten. Gruenwald was famous for his cute puppies and bunnies and kittens. So he bought that image of Chessie for $5, and that was 1933, to use with the slogan, "Sleep like a kitten, arrive fresh as a daisy in C&O air-conditioned comfort." Well, it was wildly popular. People just loved it. There were 40,000, lighting up the switchboard. And C&O knew they were onto something. So they asked Probert, "Hey, that's great. Good job. Now what are you going to do? What's next?" So he came up with 2 kittens called Nip and Tuck. And they were just carbon copies of Chessie. But again, the public received it. This was 1934. And just went wild about the cats. Well, the moral climate in 1934 was like, yeah, that's all good, but you got this mom and these 2 kids, where's dad? So in 1935, the C&O released Peak, the patriarch of the family. And now the family was complete. During the war years, Chessie sold bonds. Peak went into the Transportation Corps. And when war broke out, Peak immediately enlisted in the Army. He was always in the Army. He was a captain, but he served in all 3 theaters. He was in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. There was a wonderful backstory. People followed their exploits, And after the war, you didn't see too much about Peak. But Chessie remained until 1971, when Amtrak took over C&O Public Transportation. This is the original Gruenwald etching. More artwork from Alan Hickman. This is a T1 coming through Panther Gap near Goshen. Many people will recognize the Cliftondale Golf Course. Imagine trying to make a nice 10-foot putt with that thing running by you. A night shot. This is a Louisville and Nashville. And this is part of Alan's love of the entire all things railroad. The Chesapeake and Ohio Historical Society have over 200,000 engineering and mechanical drawings in their archives. This is a drawing of the 36-stall roundhouse that was built in Clifton Forge. It's India ink, hand-drawn on linen. So although this may be close to, say, 80, 90, 100 years old, you could still, it'll roll up nice, won't crack, crinkle. But there are thousands of examples of the fine art of the draftsman in the archives. I'm so glad this is in the show. In 1916, the Federal Trade Commission mandated that every railroad would map every mile of track that they owned because they were playing fast and loose with the valuation of the properties. They might say that outhouse cost $800, and in 1916 that was a lot of money. So the C&O, over a course of 3 years, sent surveyors out to map all of their track. What made these maps valuable today is that along the right-of-way of the railroad, the property boundaries of the landowners were marked clearly. So often in research for property boundaries, family ownership, attorneys today still come to take advantage of those valuation maps. 5 inches long and 24 inches tall. They cover, for the most part, depending upon the elements in the map, whether it's a yard, which is very busy, or just a long stretch, they'll cover 5 miles or so.
Okay.
So when you get down to east of Richmond and along the canals, because the C&O was built on the canal path of the James River Canal Company, then you have objects like the lot keeper's house, the lot keeper's stable for his oxen and horses that pulled the bateaus up and down the river. It's an amazing visual history just to look at that. So we have those. We digitized them and put them on CD-ROM for researchers. So you can go from milepost 0 all the way to Huntington on the C&O right there in your living room. These photographs were created by a well-known, famous industrial artist, William Rittis. And his photograph did not just include railways, it included almost anything in industrial America back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. This particular shot was taken from one of the light towers that stood over top of the roundhouse at Clifton Forge. So he would climb up these tall towers to get that great shot. He was a master at black and white photography. You can see the engineers working on the eccentric rods. And this is lunch, typical lunch break. Of course, it's staged for the photograph, but the employees would call that, I'm going to beans. That's what they called lunch, going to beans. And of course, here we have 2 generations of diesels down in the C&O shops in Clifton Forge. And they come into these bays where they receive their maintenance.
Now, can you tell what year any of these were taken, or were they all taken about the same time?
No, you can tell the year primarily by the equipment. So these would be in the 1930s.
Okay.
I think I recognize a G5 locomotive, which would have put it a little bit earlier than that. As a matter of fact, that one, not sure if that's the Merry Widow, but they had one small locomotive, it was a G5, that ran to Hot Springs every day. And it pulled usually a combine car, which had people and mail, a box car, and a coal car that supplied Hot Springs. And it was called the Merry Widow just because that was the only locomotive that made that run. And this is an example of C&O advertising and how they marketed things. You can see here's Chessie, still in her sleeping pose. Here's Nip and Tuck, the 2 kittens. That came out in '34. And this is a 1947 calendar. In the C&O at that time, diesels were coming on the scene, and they were quite a competition. And the C&O didn't really want to move to diesel because they had free fuel. They were hauling all their coal from West Virginia, and that's what fueled their locomotives. So they were trying to develop a coal-fired turbine that would generate electricity, like diesel engines generated electricity. And it was a very bold experiment. This M1 is what it was called, is depicted here. and one of the paintings by Charlie Hunter. And the M1, it worked really well in steamships, developing power to electric turbines. But steamships had unlimited water. So this program was developed to run a train called the Chessie from New York to Chicago. Very modern. Anything you could do on an airplane today, you could do on the Chessie train in 1950. And you could make a phone call, you could get your tickets ahead of time, and you watch movies. So it was the hope for the C&O that they could continue to use coal. Unfortunately, the technology was not, at that day, we weren't able to produce the things we needed to make that practical. So that program only lasted 3 years. Now this coaling station, you see in the background, it was designed specifically to fuel that thing, put coal in it. And there were only 3 of these locomotives. So this coaling tower sat down on the yard here in Clifton Forge, and it was modern art. It was maroon and white and silver. So after that program ended, these were dismantled. And if you could see colored pictures of Clifton Forge, 1952, you'll see garages and chicken coops that have part of this material where it was collected and repurposed. Maroon, white, and silver.
Wow.